Welcome to Unleashed, the podcast where we redefine leadership by focusing on what truly matters, the people driving change. Change leadership is about guiding people through transformation in a way that inspires them to embrace change because they believe in it. Whether you're a leader looking to foster a culture of growth or someone eager to break through barriers in life and business, this podcast is for you. Now our host, Wendi.
Welcome back to the Unleashed podcast. I'm your host, Wendi Swanson. Today's guest is a returning guest, Peter Smith. He's been in the jewelry business for 4 decades. He's the former president of Hearts on Fire, Memoire, and Vibhor. He is the author of several well-known books on selling and hiring, including Hiring Squirrels, Sell Something, and The Sales Minute. Peter is a columnist for National Jeweler and The Jewelry Book, where he writes about retail, branding, sales, and hiring. Peter, welcome to the show.
Wendi, thank you so much for having me back. I'm looking forward to this chat.
Yes, absolutely. We did have a first episode together. This is the second of 2 episodes, where the first one we talked about the psychology of sales. So we will make sure, if any of our listeners today missed that one, that in the show notes, we'll have the link to that first episode. So today we're going to move from the psychology of sales and we're going to move into Hiring Squirrels. Very interesting, very intriguing title. We'll get to that here in just a moment. Peter, you clearly have played many different roles in the jewelry industry, from being an executive leader, consultant, facilitator, author. Over the years, you've seen a lot. You've seen a lot of change, a lot of challenges. I'm curious, what still excites you about the jewelry industry?
In some respects, Wendi, I've been in it so long, it feels like a sweatshirt you don't want to throw away.
So fair.
You just had, or your favorite Aunt Mildred. I'm not sure. Look, we are blessed in that the industry that we're in is such an emotive business, right? And I don't think there's an awful lot of people, can say that. And so at its best, it's so infused with the things that are, we're marking milestones in our lives. And that doesn't have to just be engagement rings, although that certainly, perhaps next to first homes, is one of the most important purchases anybody will ever make. But that's what we do. We celebrate all these great and exciting moments in life. And in theory, at least, we should have a tremendous amount of happiness in our space. So I think that's been, for me, perhaps one of the bigger drivers, that and just a passion for retail, which is a consequence of being involved with it for so many decades. That's kind of what tickles my fancy.
Yeah, it certainly is a unique industry. I love how you said it's an emotive industry, because it is true. It's, you think about an individual who's coming in to buy an engagement ring, and it may be their 3rd largest purchase that they'll ever make in their life after a house and a car, and maybe even as much as their car. And so it truly is, there's so much emotion in jewelry. So, the importance of this industry and the effect that it has on lives, it truly is a celebration. So I would concur with that for sure.
Look, I think we forget that on occasion. I know we're going to be obviously spending the majority of our time here talking about hiring, but I think that's one of the things we perhaps have to do a better job on, is remembering exactly what you just said, right? That it is an emotional business, and not to look at it as all about numbers and all about the data and statistics and colors and clarities and, so on and so forth. But it's about humans connecting with humans. And I think that hopefully that will come through, by the way, when we get through here, is the power of that quality of just, being able to connect on an emotional level with other human beings is what tends to drive people who are so very successful.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? So is there anything in the industry that concerns you about where it's heading, about, all the changes and challenges that you've seen? What concerns do you have about where the industry's headed?
Yeah, well, we have a little bit of a paradox in our industry, in that if we just go back to, the last big reset was probably COVID, right? The onset of COVID. So if you think about where our industry came from 2019 to 20 through 2023, perhaps even through this year, we've added about 50% more to the business, right? We literally were in that 62 billion range in 2019, and we got up as high as 90 billion in 2023, 2022, 2023. So while we've added that, we've also seen a continued contraction of the number of retail jewelry stores that are out there. So I think that you have, on the one hand, the end consumer saying, hey, this is a really important, product to us. This matters to us. And they showed that in massive numbers in the COVID period. But then consequently, they're saying, but not every store is going to matter equally well. So when I think about what is the stuff that worries me, I think in some respects, and obviously it's not true of everybody, but in the retail jewelry industry specifically, there's a very slow pace of change. And I mean that as retailers, not as jewelers, but as retailers, the pace of change is very, very slow. You could talk a lot, you could speak to, why that is, but I think product dumping would be one of them, right? I think that you still, to a large extent, when you walk into retail jewelry stores, you're faced with just massive amounts of product in cases that don't really honor the product and don't really sort of champion how great product ought to look. You see it in the lack of experience, the lack of of the I know we touched on it a little bit in the previous one, but the sensory elements, right? The lighting and the smell and the sound that you put in there, how we don't use negative space to sort of champion again and make heroes of our better products. So I think that if you look at are we keeping pace in the retail jewelry business with the evolution of retail broadly? I would argue that we're not. There are certainly exceptions to that, but I would argue that we're not. And that's the thing that worries me. Not the relevance or lack thereof of the product, because I think there's no issues there, and we've seen that in the numbers. But how quickly we're changing from a model that might have worked really well in 2000 or 1990 or 1980, but maybe doesn't work so well today. I think that's where we're starting to let ourselves down a little bit.
Yeah, that is so true because you look at, especially in this industry, the good news is people are not going to stop getting married. So, we're always going to have that need. It's kind of like, during COVID, liquor stores thrived. Right.
Yeah.
People aren't going to stop. It's a sustainable industry. The same is very true of jewelry. People aren't going to stop getting married. And so it is true that change is happening so quickly. So those jewelers that can actually adapt and change and pivot with the market because it is changing so quickly are certainly going to be the ones who survive. And what we talked about in the last podcast is that experience. And a big part of that experience, especially when a customer comes into a brick and mortar store, could be the difference between the survival of that retailer and not. And so let's go there, because a big part of that experience is the people, beyond the lighting and beyond the product and beyond the environment. So
Absolutely.
I love the name of all your books. One of the books is Hiring Squirrels. Intriguing title. Tell us more about this book and how you came up with the title.
So the title was deliberately sort of a little sort of agitative, right? Because you look at all the hiring books out there, and they all basically are a version of each other. And I had read a book, and a very, very small book, one or two sort of sentences on each page, by a guy called Mac Anderson. The book came out in probably 1996, 1997. But one of the things that got my attention was, in that book, he had asked the following question. I'm paraphrasing, so it may not be exactly right. But he said, if I told you that your company mission was to climb a tree, would you train a horse or hire a squirrel? And that was a real light bulb moment for me, because it felt like our industry. It felt like in our industry, what we were trying to do was to take horses and teach them a whole bunch of product information and teach them how to climb trees. And in other words, take what couldn't be trained and try to do it instead of saying, look, squirrels already know how to climb trees. So hire that wiring, and then you can teach them things like product and process and structure and culture and all of those other things that are so very important. So that to me was again a light bulb moment where I said, what we need to do if we're looking to hire salespeople who are going to be effective salespeople, not just pleasant people who know a bunch about product, is we need to hire squirrels and then teach them how to speak about product and culture and all that kind of stuff. But you don't have to teach them how to climb trees. They already know how to do that. So the tree was a metaphor for sales wiring. That's really where that came from. So in writing the book, or to be fair, in advance of even thinking about writing the book, because I like to say that the book was written of necessity. I didn't set out to write a book. It was like, geez, I need to write a book because otherwise I'm destined to keep having the same conversation with people for God knows how long. But in the data that was collected that ended up fueling a lot of what I did in the book was we had looked at a group of salespeople, 700 salespeople, who were all employed in retail jewelry, in the best retail jewelry environments in the US, over a period of about 5 years. And we looked at their traits with the Caliper organization out of Princeton, New Jersey. They're owned by Talology, I think they're called now, but it's the Caliper traits profile. And we said, let's see how many of those people who are already employed in sales ought to be employed in sales, right? Because they already had jobs, but we don't know whether they're horses or whether they were squirrels. And so what we did was yeah, and it's obviously cemented for me at this stage. But we looked at 700 salespeople. We then broke them up into 4 categories. We broke them up into hunters, which are the classic sort of drive, very transaction driven, et cetera, self-motivated. We broke them up into farmers, which are still legitimate salespeople. They still have sales wiring, but they might have been a little bit better on the CRM aspects of it, right? Developing relationships and a little bit more patient and maybe a little bit less baggage than hunters. And then we had hybrids, which is kind of a beautiful combination of the two, of hunter farmer, but really hard to find. And the statistics will tell you why. And then wrong business. In other words, despite the fact that these people are employed in the sales position, albeit in a particular industry, they really shouldn't be. There's no part of them should be working in a sales job. And what the data showed was of 700 salespeople, 58% of them should not be in any job that has anything to do with sales.
Wow, that's high.
For instance, it is high, but when you look at other industries, to get outside of our business, it's right in line. It's right in line where most other industries are. So that was, in effect, 6 out of 10 people who are already employed in sales. Many of them, by the way, Wendi, with 10 years experience or more, many of them with great pedigree, still when it came to sales, they were just not that effective, right? They knew their way around a retail store. They knew a little bit about product. But when it came to actually the things that influence consumer behavior, some of the things that we touched on in our previous podcast, they just weren't very good. So so we said, look, hire the wiring, right? And then we can teach that stuff.
So we're going to talk a little bit about some interview questions later on in the podcast that you can ask to determine wiring. I want to dig a little bit deeper in the data and the studies that you've done, because, I too have worked with a bunch of retailers over the years, and so often, regardless of the industry, they're looking for experience either in their industry or at least experience in sales. And I've seen the same thing, Peter, over the years, that so often what happens is we hire for experience, either in or out of the industry, specifically sales experience. And we have a specific culture that we're hiring for, a specific selling process that we hire for, process, depending on whether you're in Canada or the US process.
Yeah, yeah.
And as you are training people, so often when they have that experience, you're actually untraining first so that you can retrain for your process and your culture. And it oftentimes is much more beneficial and even efficient to hire someone without any experience at all and train them your way. Is that what your data shows?
Well, the answer is yes and no, right? So I think that what I am a huge advocate of, and I think you are too in our conversations to date, is recognizing that great salespeople can come from all walks of life, right? The
Mm-hmm.
data shows that about 1 in 4 people actually have the inherent sales wiring to be good in sales. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to be want to work in sales. Some of them may be flying airplanes. Some of them may be doing heart surgery. Some of them, they got some of them have entirely other careers. But in effect, if we walked into a shopping mall and we threw a net over a gathering of people, if the sample size was big enough, we would find that about 25% of them, in fact, do have sales wiring. But let me share a story with you to sort of underscore the point about the merits of hiring for experience and hiring for pedigree, right? We call it pedigree in our industry. I was teaching a session at an educational event, a 3-day educational event in Las Vegas many years ago. And I was teaching the same session twice, once in the morning for a group of owners of about 150 owners of independent retail jewelry stores, and then for another group of about 150 of them in the afternoon. And in the morning session, one of the retailers asked the following question. Again, I'm paraphrasing, right? I'm not sure it's exactly the
Mm-hmm.
question he asked, but he said basically, to what extent do you see experience and pedigree aligning with sales acumen? And I said, geez, great question. So I said, let me ask you guys a question. And I said, can you put your hand up if you have at least one graduate gemologist, one GG on staff? And by the way, this is not a criticism of GGs any more than, product training would be not that important for a pilot or not that important for a heart surgeon. But this is just to make the point. So, of about 150 of them, about 2/3 raised their hand to say, yep, we've got at least one graduate gemologist on staff. Now, what that means in obviously in our language is they've got really good product information. And it's reasonable to assume they've also been around the business a little bit. So you have both experience and you have pedigree.
Mm.
We had a data point as a company that we used at that point to determine what champion salespeople looked like, right? And so we call them champions. And I said, okay, for those of you who have your hands aloft, would you leave your hand up if one or more of those GGs is also a champion, right? In other words, can we align the experience and the pedigree with the actual sales performance? And out of the 100 or so hands that were up, right about 2/3 of the room, there was not a single example where that one of those GGs, one of those graduate gemologists, was also one of the sales champions, right? And we had about 60 of them at that particular conference. And there wasn't a single example. So that, if you'd have said to me, hey, what do you think this is going to look like? I would have said inverse relationship,
Mm-hmm.
but I would not have guessed zero. So
Mm.
we had the similar group in the afternoon, and I said, hey, I want to share a question with you. Can you put your hand up if you have at least one graduate gemologist on staff? Again, about 2/3 of the hands went up. And when I said, leave your hand up if one or more of them is a champion. And again, Wendi, there was not a single hand that went up. Now, when you think about the statistical data on that, you had about 300 unique stores. Let's say they had an average of 5 salespeople per store. That is 1,500 salespeople.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't a single example where the person who knew the most in product was also a very, very good salesperson, was also a top salesperson. So that data absolutely blew me away because it was, again, I would have guessed from experience there would be an inverse relationship between lots of product knowledge and the
Mm-hmm.
ability to actually move people.
Mm-hmm.
And but I would never have guessed it would have been that profound.
Yeah. So that's big. And part of me saying, yep, not surprising, because we've all as consumers probably walked into an electronics store or walked into a furniture store or walked into a jewelry store and the salesperson is talking over us. I call it feature dumping. I think you call it product dumping, where it's
Yeah,
feature, 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 feature. There's no personal connection. My head is, my eyes are like a cartoon character, going like,
yeah, yeah.
around and around because they're talking so far over my head. It's just not a great experience versus someone who can actually connect on a personal level and get it down from a lifestyle to the benefits of what it is that we're selling and really being able to match, why do I want to buy this? Jewelry is emotional. And
Right.
so if I'm not
100%.
making that emotional connection, because it's just all about here's what it has, here's what it has, here's what it has. I think there's very few people who can do both. And I think, as you said, be the champion where they have the pedigree and the performance.
That's right.
So, what is the answer then? What are those things that align a champion? If I understand you correctly, the pedigree and the performance, what is the secret sauce?
Right. So I think again in the previous pod we talked exactly about what you said, where when the first thing they do when you walk in and seek to engage somebody, they unfurl the tag on the piece of jewelry, right? They immediately default to that. And I have said to people, and sometimes when I do these psychology trainings, is in some respects, if you're talking to a person who is, let's say, a very nervous flyer, right? You and I do a whole bunch of flying. I'll be on a plane here in a couple of days. And if you sit down with somebody who's clearly, just shaking at the prospect of having to get on a flight, even though they know they need to do it, if you say to them, okay, look, there's 45,000 flights in a day. Do you know that? And do you know that there's 16 million flights in a year, just in the US? And do you know that there's only 300 crashes? And the vast majority of those crashes are one person and two person. That's the last thing they want to hear, right?
Yeah, not helpful.
There's nothing whatsoever there at all. But if you say to them, hey, look, especially if you're in a position where you could actually touch them, right? Physically touch their hand or their shoulder or their
Mm-hmm.
elbow, and you can say, it's okay to be nervous. You'd be surprised at the amount of people who are nervous. This is going to be okay. You'll be okay. I promise you. In other words, if you go into an emotive situation as opposed to unfurling the cognitive tag and then telling them how many flights there are a day without any crashes and all that kind of nonsense. And I think we do that in our industry. So one of the things, to answer your question in terms of the traits and the important wiring, I've coined a term of late that I think is sort of the next step up from hiring squirrels, and that is doers. I want people to hire doers,
Mm-hmm.
and that's DOER, S, the doers in the plural. And what that means is that, first of all, the D is drive. This idea that you can motivate somebody to do something that they are not motivated to do is a complete nonsense. I don't care who said, I'm going to go, let's give a motivational speech. No, you might give an uplifting speech, but you're not going to motivate somebody to want to do something they are not fundamentally motivated to do. Now, if you want to have a conversation about demotivating people, easy, right? Hire a
100%.
crappy manager.
Yeah.
Demotivated. Everybody's demotivated. So drive, inner drive, innate drive is a huge important trait. And that can reflect in somebody's background without them ever having been in sales. Perhaps it is sport, perhaps it is, debate team, perhaps it is any number
Mm-hmm.
of things from their professional background or even their academic background that would say, this person's competitive, right? So they have
Mm-hmm.
that drive there. Angela Duckworth called it you grit, right? She wrote a
Yes.
very interesting book about grit. You have to have that because it is not trainable. So that's the first thing is drive. The second thing is optimism, right? There might be some people out there, but in all of the decades I've been sort of doing this and building sales teams and running sales teams and writing about people and what have you, I have never yet met a pessimist who's a great salesperson. So we want optimism as a sort of a default place. That doesn't mean that they don't get ticked off about certain things. That doesn't mean that they don't occasionally have a down day or what have you, or have other things going on in their lives. But in effect, you want salespeople who are optimistic. They believe that their customer is better for engaging with them. They believe that they're better for having their product. That's a trait again that I find. Now that one is both innate and you can practice it, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
think motivation is a little bit more related to our innate traits, but I think that optimism, while it is also, I think that can be practiced and people can learn to look on the at the glass as half full instead of half empty. The next one is empathy, right? If you don't care about people, you're not going to be very good in sales. And, we've heard the joke often enough over the years that, geez, this sales gig wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't for all these people, and that just doesn't work. You have to be empathic. And that's a very difficult thing. You can emphasize it. You can, again, put some guardrails around it, but you really have to care. You really want to listen to people and to observe all of the nonverbal cues and the body language cues and whatnot in order to be very, very good in sales. And then the last of the what I'll call that sort of big four on the doer is resilience, right? We know that the psychologists have discovered that rejection in the brains of folks who don't have sufficient reserves of resilience, again, which is very much an innate trait. In fact, three of the four, I would argue, are really innate traits. Um, when they're rejected, guess what? In sales, it's going to happen a lot. And guess what? In retail sales, it's going to happen even more because you're there every single day with folks coming in. If your close rate is 30%, that means you're getting 7 no's. If your close rate is 20%, it means you're getting 8 versions of no.
It's a game of failure. There's no doubt. That's right.
We talked about Ted Williams at one point, right? The fact that Ted Williams, the greatest hitter in the history of baseball, and he failed about 7 out of 10 times, right?
That's
But
right.
he expected to get a hit every single time he went up there. So resilience in their brain when they hear rejection, if they don't have solid resilience, is like physically being assaulted. And so to hire somebody and put them into a sales role and then say to them, you should be okay just hearing some version of no again and again, it just doesn't work. So doer is drive, optimism, empathy, and resilience. Those traits are critical to be very successful in sales.
As you're talking, I'm getting very excited because I'm thinking about my son who just a year ago started his career in sales, which has been so fun to watch him. He was, promoted not too long ago. And, so I'm going through my checklist going, yep, yep, yep. And the company that he works for, Peter, is phenomenal. It's an HRIS company. They sell, they do payroll and then they do, other HR software services, a phenomenal company. And one of the things when he was going through the interview process that he discovered is the majority of the people that they interview and hire were collegiate athletes because they have found that they have that competitive spirit, as you would call a doer. They certainly are optimistic. My son was a baseball player. The resiliency of playing baseball is tremendous. And so when you look at those four characteristic traits, you talked earlier about wiring. So are those four traits part of the wiring, or do they need to have the wiring as their first level and then you're screening out the other four traits. How do those
Yeah.
four traits relate to wiring?
So two things. First of all, you're right that there is a good correlation between having had sports backgrounds and somehow finding a way to translate that into sales. But I think it's worth pointing out that there's a multitude of ways somebody can get to that same place. They don't have to have obviously played sports, but there has to be evidence in their background
Mm-hmm.
of having overcome stuff. Sometimes
Right.
that's a really tough upbringing. Sometimes that's lots of disappointments, but they show a tremendous track record of having sort of accomplished stuff. And so you can get there from that standpoint too. In terms of the traits, they are the traits, right? So that is the quadrant of hugely important traits: drive, or whatever you want to call that, but that sort of self-motivation, right? Optimism, empathy, and resilience. And I think that hiring those traits, or at least as close as you can to doing that, and then building all of that other stuff, product and culture and process and all of that. That to me is how this works best. If you recognize that those traits matter, then the question becomes, great, how do I find them? What do they look like, and how do I
Mm-hmm.
get?
Well, and you're leading me right there to my next question is, as I'm listening to you, one of the things that I'm sure you hear every day of your life, as do I, it's just really hard to find great people. And what we know is that post COVID, 33% of the labor force never returned. And so we've always heard it's difficult to find great people. And today, I do believe it is more difficult because people have found that they can be creative. They're working from home, they're influencers. A high percentage of people have retired. So, how do we hire for these four traits and not compromise because we need somebody on the floor today and we need somebody who can work nights and weekends? So what would you say to these people who are listening to this saying, yes, I agree, and yet it's really difficult, especially in retail, to find these great people that have these traits?
Yeah. In some respects, the answer gets back to one of the things we talked about earlier when you said, what are the things you might be worried about in
Mm,
retail? That if we don't have an evolved environment, if we don't have an exciting experiential place to work, why would somebody want to come there? And to some degree, that's a little bit like we don't have to outrun the bear, right? We have to outrun the other guy. In other words, we have to create the kind of a work environment that is attractive to people, especially so to younger people. We're talking about younger millennials and and older or Gen Z. And then I would add to that you know, your inability to find people, if there is no structured process to how to do that, those things just happen to be they don't coexist. You need to have a process, and if you
mhm,
have a really good process, and then you want to come to me and talk to me about how difficult it is to find people, I'll listen to you. But if you don't have a process, then I think all you're doing is you're shooting from the hip and then complaining about the things that, quite frankly, you don't control, right? So we talk a lot about control the controllables, having a process to identify and hire candidates who you might not be thinking about at this point, but who might be great for your business. That's the first step. And we all have the ability to put a process in place. Once you have that, then come back and tell me you can't find people. But
mhm.
if you're looking for them the same way you looked for them in 1980, in 1990, and even in 2000,
That's right.
then you're not doing the right stuff.
Yeah. Well, and now more than ever, if someone doesn't have a job, there's oftentimes a reason they don't have a job. And so oftentimes, we're looking for people in the wrong places, is indeed the absolute best place to find the absolute best people with these four traits? Probably not. So, you look at the best possible people may actually be the people who actually have a job. We have to do this differently than just simply having an ATS, an applicant tracking system, and we just hope that we find someone who applies. Sometimes we have to go get them. So you're right that that process is critical. They just may not show up on your doorstep.
So true. And part of that process, Wendi, is accepting that there are people in jobs that they would never think that they might be very, very good in sales, and especially so in a retail jewelry sales environment. And they may actually think that they wouldn't even get interviewed in a retail sales environment until we tell them otherwise. In other words, so in our outreach process, if we say, here's what we're looking for, here's what matters to us. And one of the things I had written in the book and I use in the white paper I put together is experience not wanted, right? Which is very different than experience not needed, because experience not needed says, I'd really like you to have experience. I'd really prefer if you had a couple of years experience. But experience not wanted tells the brain, hey, there's something different about this. Let me read it. And then if what you're reading speaks to things you have, even though you've never been in sales, perhaps never even thought about sales, then you're more apt to just sort of say, well, look, I read your post, looked like it was talking to me, even though I don't have experience. But you said you don't want that. So I think that's part of having the process is setting up a structured interview process. And then within that interview process, asking the kinds of questions that would suggest that the wiring that we're looking for, that drive, optimism, empathy, and resilience, is in fact present. So I think we own that. Right?
Yeah. Walk us through some of those interview questions. What's the magic sauce in interviewing for wiring?
Well, I think that, first of all, you have to have the whole structure in place, but I'll give you a couple of examples of the questions. Like one, for instance, is, and if this is somebody who's in sales, and I'll give you the version if they're not, is what do you like most about sales? Is this just simply ask that question. And if we get an answer that's really, I love the product, and but by the way, this happens all the time. I love the product. I'm a big fan of jewelry and so on and so forth. That might not be the answer that you want. By the way, if it's somebody who's not got experience, you can ask them, what do you think you might enjoy most about sales? And what we want to hear, obviously, is some version of, look, I love people. And I know that people who come into this environment, they're celebrating engagements and anniversaries and important birthdays and all of that. Or maybe they just recovered from an illness and they're celebrating themselves and their own grit and resilience or whatever it might be. So that's an example. Another one would be on a scale of 1 to 10, how competitive are you? Right. And this doesn't have to be somebody who was an athlete, but it could be in any walk of life. And I will get asked a question occasionally, well, what answer do you want to hear in that situation? And I will say the truth, right? So if they tell me, well, I think I'm probably a 3, that's a great answer. Because now you want to say, why do you rate yourself a 3? And what you may get from that is they're not really that competitive, right? This is just not somebody who's going to be very competitive. They say, which you sometimes hear, 11. Wow, you're 11 out of 10. First of all, the math doesn't work so well. We got a huge amount of confidence there. Tell me why. And what you want to hear in that situation is real specific examples of why, in fact, that would be true. Why, in fact, they would be massively competitive, right? So that's a great question. Another one might be, what do you think the primary role of a salesperson is? And what we want there is to engage other people and to sell, to actually move the bar, some version of to move the bar. Because if what we get is, to just answer questions and be pleasant, I would worry about that. And then last one I might throw out at you is, what does active listening mean to you? Right. And again, these are all, as you have heard, open-ended questions that invite feedback around things that in many respects get to their inherent wiring. And of course, once the questions are answered, the next important question is the follow-up. So if somebody says, again, if they say, I'm an 11 out of 10, great, tell me why. Right? I drove 30% increases over the course of my career, and great, I love that. Tell me how. Right? It's just those follow-up questions. So that would be an example of some examples of those questions where, again, I'm trying to get at the resilience. Of resilience, I might say, tell me about a failure of yours. And it's amazing when you ask somebody to describe a failure, you will sometimes see them begin to collapse a little bit physically, right? As they recount what this failure was, or they might just sort of create some made up thing where you think, okay, that's not somebody who's really being very honest about this. I want to know that they had failures, and I want to know that it didn't collapse them, that they learn. What did you learn from that failure, and so on and so forth? So they're open ended questions that get at their innate wiring. Right?
Hmm.
That's really what it's about.
Yes. So good. I was listening to a podcast this week that, it was talking about behavioral interviewing and how important it is to get them to the application side, because so often, we have people who are interviewing and, they've got a line of 5 or 6 people who, I've got another interview in 30 minutes. And so what they're doing is they're simply just using that interview guide and they're
Right.
just using the check marks and they're not doing something that you hit on that is so important. They themselves are not modeling active listening and truly getting beyond the answers and getting down to who that applicant really is as a person. I know, one of the things that you said was that competitive nature. You want somebody who, especially if we're in an incentive-based pay environment, you want somebody that is motivated by money. And so we used to ask the question, I'm curious, what's more important to you, money or a job well done? And it was so interesting to hear people's answers because so many people want to answer, quote unquote, the right way. They think that you want to hear, oh, of course, a job well done. Well, hello, we are hiring for a sales position. I want
Right.
someone who,
Right.
obviously, the right answer is both. A job well done should result in money. At the end of the day, I want that competitive spirit unapologetically. I don't want someone that's going to be on the sales floor that's, oh, there's going to be another customer. Oh, that's okay. I'll be back. We know that
Yeah,
the be back bus
that's
is
right.
not coming back. So to get that wiring and that competitive spirit to come out in the interview and get beyond the right answers, I think is such a great approach, Peter.
I think that, yeah, and I'm sure you've seen it in the course of your career. I've seen it too. You can find really outstanding salespeople who are paid really poorly, right? And those are always an interesting study for me because I look at great salespeople and I try to understand what makes them tick. And to a large extent, wherever they might stay there, however long is a whole other matter. Sometimes it's sort of only game in town, and they're kind of stuck with an employer who maybe doesn't appreciate them the way they ought to. But what always matters, even to those people, is the scorecard, right? And money can serve as the scorecard, but even where people are not paid a whole lot of money, they still want to see themselves up on top of that list. They
Yeah.
want to know that they've accomplished more than their colleagues. They've got that sort of hopefully healthy competition because we hope it's not toxic and undermining behavior. But the money often serves as a proxy for the scorecard. If you're
Mhm.
making the most money, that's because you had the most success. And even in environments, again, where you're not perhaps paid, where there's not a meritocracy, which I'll never understand in sales, right? Well, we sort of like everybody to get along. And so everybody sort of gets paid about the same. And we don't do commission or bonuses or any of that kind of stuff. Well, that tells me you're losing a fortune, right? But it's the meritocracy that says you are accomplishing things, and when they see those sales goals go up, they want to be up the top. That's just the way top performers are wired.
Mhm. So I'm curious also, Peter, one of the things that my son got to do as he was interviewing the final stage, and I think he had 3 interviews. I think he had a recruiter and then he had the hiring manager and then he had the regional director. So actually it was the fourth interview, the final interview was with a team. So he had the opportunity to come in and present to the team, here's who I am, here's why you
Right.
want me on your team. And the team actually had some skin in the game in choosing this person. So, in hiring, when we're just looking at one person's perspective and the manager did the hire and then the manager did the second interview and the team really didn't get to choose. And we look at, in life, you're spending more time at work oftentimes than you are with your family. And so this person needs to fit with the team. So I thought that was so interesting to give someone the opportunity, especially in a retail floor, to come in and observe our culture, to come in and meet the team. And they actually have some skin in the game in terms
Right.
of whether or not this person is chosen. What do you think
Yeah.
about that?
I'm a fan of multiple interviewers. And again, whether that's two or three or an entire team, what I would caution against is if you believe, as certainly I do, that a process is critical. Everybody needs to adhere to the procedure, right? So, in other
100%.
words,
Yes.
if you're putting, which I'm a massive advocate of, you should have very specific questions already lined up to go before that person shows up. And those questions should get at nominally three things, right? One is the stuff we've been talking about, which is the drivers, the innate sort of traits. There ought to be a whole series of questions designed to uncover the innate traits. The other might be a series of questions designed sort of to, I'll call it resume exploration. In other words, did that actually happen? Were they there? Is it real? Are there unexplained situations that we should talk about? But to sort of that resume exploration. And the third area, which is I think a little bit about what you're getting at, is culture fit, right? Because you can have somebody who's wonderful in terms of the traits, but still might not fit into that culture. Now, I'll give you a quick, sort of simple example of that. If somebody has great driver traits and innate traits, empathy, resilience, the whole thing, optimism, but they're going into an environment that does not prize sales performance as a meritocracy. What they're looking for is lots of pleasant people that get along. And they don't want somebody who's going to be a driver or somebody who's going to really take that business to another level. Crazy as it sounds, but there are plenty of businesses like that.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to do well in that culture because the things that matter to them, that scorecard that I referred to a short while ago, won't be in place. And so if they were to come work in an environment like that or in a culture like that where they have the up system, right? We all take turns, which I'm just not a fan of at all. Or we don't pay commission because we want no pressure on the customers as though somehow they came in and knew exactly what they wanted and what they wanted to spend. Those environments don't lend themselves to top performers. And occasionally I'll hear people say, well, that's toxic and we don't want that. There's a big, big difference between having some baggage that ought to be managed and being toxic. I'm a big fan of if it's toxic behavior, get it out fast. But if it's somebody who's a real superstar player and there's some baggage that needs to be managed, then manage the baggage,
That's
right?
right.
Because ultimately the
That's right.
business need. It'd be like sort of saying, hey, that quarterback, he can do everything, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't like his attitude. Can you manage it?
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
this guy pleasant as all heck, but he can't throw the ball.
I
Right?
think we would all agree that our top performers are not always the easiest manage. In fact, they're usually the most difficult manage, which is why so often managers choose nice over a performer, which is a whole
Absolutely.
nother podcast. It sounds like
Absolutely.
your process, though, really helps to screen out some of those things. And I love what you said, culture. You put this right person into a culture that is not a driving culture. It's a let's just keep the peace culture. They could be a
Right.
phenomenal salesperson in terms of their wiring and their traits, and it's the wrong culture. So I think you're right.
Absolutely.
You put those two
Yeah.
things together, right person, right culture, sounds like that's where the magic sauce
So
happens.
I talked about, and hiring squirrels certainly touches on that. And I produced a white paper, a hiring white paper. And in that white paper, we also have questions to uncover whether they're a fit with your specific culture. It'll
So
talk
good.
about some things you might want to because that interview really is the threefold. It's the traits, it's the resume, and it's the culture, and they all have to sort of be aligned.
Hmm.
Or else you're not going to hire. Now we tend to be a little better at the resume stuff and a little better at the culture stuff. We tend to not get the traits, so that's where I spend most of my time.
Yeah. And I want to reiterate the importance of following, having a process and following that process because it is so true, Peter. If you are asking different questions in the interview process, and some people you're having them come in and meet with your team, and some people you're not, you're making information based on very different data points.
Yeah.
And so that process, I could not agree more, is crucial to finding the best possible person. So good.
Otherwise, it looks like a dating game, right? You get people who go rogue. They decide to ask the questions they want to ask. They don't understand. Like I did a hiring workshop a few weeks ago, 4 or 5 hour hiring workshop with a retail jeweler. And they said, everybody, whoever is put in front of a candidate that is being interviewed has to go through this process and has to be fully versed on that white paper. They have to understand exactly what they're doing. Otherwise, you get it on a cognitive level, you get it even perhaps on a philosophical level, but you're not putting it into practice. And you can't do that because that just becomes a dating game. Is he nice? Is he pleasant? Yeah, let's hire him. And that's the way we do it, quite frankly.
That's unfortunately the story of my dating life, Peter. So clearly I need to apply these principles to my dating life. So good.
That's definitely another podcast, but just not with me.
Would you write a book on that? Let's see. Dating squirrels. No. What would that be?
Probably not. No. I don't think my wife would be too pleased me writing that book.
So good. Well, Peter, we have so much more to unpack, and I would highly encourage, if you are a listener today, to please pick up the book Hiring Squirrels. So good. And there's just so much information. Peter also, as he mentioned, has a white paper on this. And so we will make sure that Peter's information is in the show notes for the podcast. So as we're wrapping this up, Peter, for our listeners, what do they need to do today? If you were to say, 1 or 2 things, do this today so that you can hire better, what would that be?
So just a heads up, I know that I'm going to put some books in, you're going to put some books, recommended books on this topic into the show notes. And some of those books are not books that were written this year or last, but they're classics on the genre. Yeah, Good to Great with Jim Collins, and How to Hire A Players with Eric Harancole, and First Break All the Rules with Buckingham, which blew my mind the first time I read it. But I think if I was to say you got to do one thing, you have to have a process, right? So you don't have to go buy Hiring Squirrels, you don't have to buy my white paper, but you have to create a process with a structure designed to uncover the wiring. And if you need to get help, like that's what people like you and I do, right? We're consultants and we do this stuff, then get help from somebody who can actually help you get there, and then read some more on the topic, because you not being successful hiring does not mean that it's as difficult as you're making it out. You just simply have to have a process.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And, Peter, I think about marketing. Companies spend so much time and effort and strategy on marketing, and our people are just as important. We spend so much time on product strategy, and yet when it comes to people, so often it's like, let's see, do they have a pulse? Can they work nights and weekends? Done. And we can have all the best marketing, customers coming into our stores. We can have phenomenal product. And we all know that if that customer actually comes into a store and they have a mediocre experience with a person, it costs the company greatly.
That's right.
And so I appreciate your passion. I appreciate your enthusiasm. I appreciate the tips and tricks in finding the best people and not compromising on that. So, Peter, thank you so much for being on our show today.
Thanks for having me, Wendy. It's been a pleasure. I've enjoyed the chat.
We look forward to the next time. Thank you so much for listening in to Unleashed. Stay tuned next week. A new episode's coming out.
Thanks for listening to Unleashed with Wendy Swanson. Make sure to subscribe and follow to be notified when the newest episodes of the podcast go live. Please take a moment to rate and review us. It helps others discover Unleashed and join our movement of forward-thinking leaders. You can find contact information and important links in the show notes. Stay tuned for the next episode, and remember, keep leading with authenticity, embrace change, and choose to live life unleashed.